thanks everyone for getting up early to be here. I hope my iPad drawing of Africa makes it worthwhile. I haven't quite figured out how to colour inside the lines on my iPad yet, so apologies for that. So this paper's based on the research for my PhD thesis, which, as Jan said, is about the economic partnership agreements between the EU and African, Caribbean and Pacific countries. The central puzzle of my thesis is about why the EU has had such a hard time trying to impose a kind of comprehensive trade liberalisation agenda on the ACP countries in the context of these highly asymmetrical negotiations between the EU and small regions of developing countries. In this paper, I'm just looking at one aspect of that, so I'm going to look specifically at the case study from the thesis, which is EU Southern Africa trade relations and EPA negotiations. And I'm looking at that puzzle from a slightly different direction. So in this paper specifically, I'm addressing African resistance to trade liberalisation or African agency in those trade negotiations. And I'm trying to contribute to a kind of growing literature that talks about small country agency and influence within international politics and within trade negotiations specifically. And what I'm trying to do in this iteration of this paper, which has been developing for much too long, is to offer a kind of slightly more nuanced account of how African agency works within the context of trade negotiations, and to suggest that it's not just about resistance, but that actually there's a more complex process of intra-regional contestation going on within these negotiations between Southern African countries and the EU. So I'll just say a little bit more about that puzzle that I'm trying to address in this paper to start with, which is all about the outcome of the Economic Partnership Agreement in Southern Africa. So what we see in this negotiation between the EU and Southern Africa, it started in 2002, it was supposed to finish in 2007 according to the timeline for the negotiations. A few countries in the region signed up to a very limited version of the Economic Partnership Agreement at that time in 2007, but they were all resistant to some of the deeper trade integration, trade liberalisation measures that the EU was trying to promote. And an agreement was eventually signed in 2014, but it was a much watered down version of what the EU had originally intended for the Economic Partnership Agreement. So what we see here is resistance to an externally imposed EU agenda of trade liberalisation for quite an extended period of time, and an eventual relatively watered down version of the agreement, which is a puzzle in itself because these were highly asymmetrical negotiations. The EU really wanted to promote this deep trade liberalisation agenda. All of the original, or a lot of the original literature on the economic partnership agreements just sort of assumed that it would be possible for the EU to enforce this agenda on the ACP countries, and that hasn't turned out to be the case in Southern Africa and also elsewhere. So that's an interesting puzzle to start with in itself. What I think makes the Southern African case particularly interesting is that actually some of the countries had initially been willing or quite keen to sign up to some of the EU's more ambitious liberalisation agenda on services and investment. So it's a puzzle, how did we get to this situation where actually none of the countries ended up signing up to that more ambitious agenda, even though some of them were relatively keen to do that earlier in the process. So it's a story of some limited success for African agency and African resistance, but perhaps not a straightforward dynamic of EU tries to impose a trade liberalisation agenda on Southern African countries and they resist. It's more complex than that, and there's a more complex kind of intra-regional dynamic going on at the same time as this negotiation between the EU and Southern African countries. Okay, so just a very quick slide about the African agency trade literature. So there's been an increasing focus on African agency and other small developing country agency in a number of arenas, including international trade negotiations. The existing literature on African agency and trade, which is quite small but growing, tends to highlight the resistance to an externally imposed liberalisation agenda via kind of discursive contestation, so challenging the EU's narratives about the benefits of trade liberalisation, basically. But it tends to present African agency as a relatively unified, unitary thing, all of these African countries resisting trade liberalisation together, and that's not quite the story that we see in Southern Africa, I don't think. So what I'm suggesting is two kind of extensions or additions to that literature, perhaps. So the first one is that there's considerable differentiation in the negotiating positions of different African countries, and that they interpret the costs and benefits of trade liberalisation in relation to the EU in very different ways. So agency is not just about straightforward resistance, it's about taking different positions and interpreting trade negotiations in different ways by different African agents. And the second contribution or extension, as I've already hinted at, the intra-regional politics of the Southern African region plays a really important part in these negotiations, and the relationship between the Southern African countries has a big impact on the way that they then interpret trade negotiations with the EU. Just a little bit of background on the economic partnership agreements before I get into the kind of meat of the empirical findings of the paper. So basically, the story is that the EU offered unilateral trade preferences to the ACP countries from 1975 under the Lomé Convention. So ACP countries got preferential access to the EU market, they didn't have to reciprocate. The EU had a special relationship with the ACP countries from the Treaty of Rome onwards, but it was in 1975 that it offered unilateral trade preferences to the ACP countries. The Lomé Convention was challenged under the GATT and the WTO in the early 1990s, and the GATT ruled against it and said this is not a legal way of offering trade preferences to developing countries because the Lomé Convention discriminated between different developing countries at the same level of development. Following those rulings, the EU basically decided that it needed to replace the Lomé Convention with intra-regional reciprocal trade agreements. So the ACP countries would have to sign up to trade agreements with the EU in which they liberalised trade in goods on a reciprocal basis in order to carry on receiving this preferential access that they'd had since 1975 to the EU. That's a very simplified version of the story. There's lots more about that in my thesis. If you want to read it, I'd be happy to send it to you. And the EU's preference was also for these agreements to go beyond just trade in goods. So in order to make them WTO compatible, they had to cover trade in goods on a reciprocal basis. They didn't have to cover services, investment, any of those sort of WTO plus issues, but the EU's preference was that they would include those things. So the choice for ACP countries when it came to the deadline in 2007, which is when this WTO waiver expired, was either they could sign an agreement on trade in goods at least, or risk losing their preferential access to the EU market. And they also had a choice about whether they wanted to sign up to this comprehensive trade agenda that the EU was trying to promote. Again, that's a bit of a simplified version of the choice that they had, but we can talk more about that in the discussion. I think the most interesting thing that I find in this paper is the differentiated response of different ACP countries within Southern Africa to this choice that they faced at the end of 2007 and beyond 2007. So I've divided the countries into EPA enthusiasts and EPA skeptics, which is a slightly crude way of dividing up the countries, I think, and there's more in the paper about the specific positions of individual countries within the negotiations, but I think that kind of crude distinction reflects something important about the negotiations in that region. And what's particularly interesting about that division is that it doesn't reflect the kind of extent to which these countries were materially reliant on existing trade preferences from the EU, so you can't necessarily read off these different responses to the economic partnership agreements based on those kind of material incentives that the EU was providing. So for example, Botswana is dependent on EU preferences for its beef exports, but they only make up a very small proportion of Botswana's exports to the EU. They have kind of cultural and political significance, but they're not a huge kind of economically important sector. Nonetheless, Botswana was really keen to sign up to the Economic Partnership Agreement. Namibia, on the other hand, was really much more reliant on EU preferences for beef, grapes, and a couple of other things, but it was much more sceptical about the Economic Partnership Agreement. So you can't necessarily read off their position in the negotiations based on their reliance on existing preferences. What's also interesting is the role of South Africa and the relationship with South Africa and how that played out in the formation of preferences in relation to the Economic Partnership Agreement negotiations. So this first set of countries, when I interviewed officials from those countries, suggested that they saw the potential for trade benefits of comprehensive EPAs, so they were interested in signing up to services and investment parts of the Economic Partnership Agreement as well as trading goods. They saw potential benefits of that for promoting regulatory reform and attracting inward investment, which is what the EU was saying that it would do, but they were also really concerned about lessening their economic dependence on South Africa and promoting inward investment from places other than South Africa, and that was a lot of their motivation for signing up to the Economic Partnership Agreement. So this is the kind of intra-regional dimension that I'm talking about in terms of how countries form their preferences in relation to the Economic Partnership Agreements. The second group of countries was much less convinced by the kind of benefits that the EU was claiming for the Economic Partnership Agreements. They saw them entirely as a kind of trade-off. They would only give up their policy space for interventionist trade policies if they were going to receive significantly better access to the EU market. They weren't convinced by any of the benefits of this kind of regulatory reform. They weren't interested in signing up to services and investment clauses. And those two countries, Angola and Namibia, had much closer political ties with South Africa, which also shaped their positions in the negotiations. So up to 2009, South Africa had been kind of, although it's this hugely powerful regional actor, it hadn't kind of managed to get all its ducks in a row. Some countries had signed up to an interim economic partnership agreement. South Africa hadn't signed. Those enthusiastic countries were continuing services and investment negotiations with the EU. South Africa didn't want the region to sign up to that kind of comprehensive agreement. But up to 2009, it hadn't really managed to do anything about it. After 2009, the dynamics of the negotiations changed. And since this is a paper about African agency, I thought I should have some African agents for you. So this is Xavier Karim, the chief negotiator from South Africa, and Rob Davies, the trade minister, and they were very influential in how the negotiation played out after 2009. So what they did was they put lots of pressure on their regional partners to say, actually, we're not going to go ahead and implement this agreement that we've signed. We want to negotiate a completely different agreement with the EU. They threatened to disband the customs union that Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, Swaziland were all part of, and that would have really big effects for those countries' income from the customs pool that was part of that customs union. So South Africa started to use its kind of leverage within the region much more after 2009, and that was really effective. Botswana, which was the most enthusiastic country, said, okay, we're not going to implement this agreement that we signed, we're going to stop negotiating on services and investment. So South Africa was really able to use its influence in that sense. At the same time, the negotiators were deploying discursive challenges to the EU's comprehensive trade agenda. That's very political sciencey language. So they were criticising the EU's approach to the trade negotiations, basically. They were saying it was damaging to regional integration, perhaps a bit ironic when South Africa was seen to be bullying its regional partners in such a clear way. They were saying it would be damaging to the smaller partners' development prospects if they signed up to a comprehensive agreement. And those challenges were fairly effective, I think, along with sort of lots of wider challenges to the EPA process and the EU's position, and lots of kind of NGO opposition to what the EU was doing. So the final agreement that was signed in 2014 reflects EU concessions to the South African position within the negotiations. They didn't agree at anything on services and investment. They made concessions on some other technical issues, the MFN clause, the ban on export taxes, that sort of thing, and they made some market access concessions to South Africa. I think the key point here is that the Southern African region was able to reach this watered down version of the Economic Partnership Agreement. It's not a straightforward story of resistance of the whole region. It was all about Africa bullying some of the smaller South Africa, bullying some of the smaller partners in the region to not accept the more ambitious deal that they had already accepted and had shown some sort of keenness to negotiate further on services and investment, and about South Africa's ability to kind of deploy these challenges to the EU's strategy rhetorically. Okay, so a few quick conclusions. So the SADC minus EPA wasn't the result of straightforward compromise between kind of EU imposition and African resistance. Rather, it reflects a set of differentiated responses to the choice set on offer under the Economic Partnership Agreements and the strategic interactions and power plays between African regional partners. So I think coercive pressures from external actors are really important in these kind of north-south trade negotiations, but they're also mediated by the interpretations of African agents and how they respond to the choice set that's on offer to them, and the kind of regional context in which they're placed, which shapes their reaction to external pressures. That's it.
Great. Thank you.